There are moments in life when a single choice splits your world into before and after. For Sarah Chen, that moment came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March in the fluorescent lit silence of County General's 6th floor. She had spent 5 years perfecting the art of emotional distance, moving through her night shifts like a ghost among the dying and the desperate. She believed that detachment was survival, that caring too much would destroy her. She was wrong. Sometimes the people we're meant to save end up saving us instead. This is the story of one night that changed everything.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
Sarah Chen pushed through the heavy double doors of County General Hospital's 6th floor at exactly 10:47 p.m., 3 minutes before her shift officially began. Punctuality was one of the few things she could control in a job where chaos was the only constant. The antiseptic smell hit her immediately, that particular blend of bleach, illness, and institutional despair that had long since stopped bothering her. If anything, it had become a perverse comfort, a signal that she was entering the only world where she still felt competent. The nurse station was a small island of harsh light in the dimmed hallway. Margaret, the evening shift nurse, looked up from her computer with the exhausted gratitude of someone who had been counting down the minutes until relief arrived. "Quiet night," Margaret said, which both of them knew was a lie or a curse, or possibly both. In 5 years of night shifts, Sarah had learned that the moment someone declared things quiet was precisely when everything would go wrong. "Patient count?" Sarah asked, setting down her insulated lunch bag and reaching for the hand sanitizer. 14 occupied rooms, 2 post-ops, 1 pneumonia, 3 cardiac monitors, and the usual mix. Room 304 is new, came up from emergency around 6. Daniel Torres, 42, heart failure, waiting list for transplant. She pulled up the chart on the screen. Quiet guy, barely says 2 words. Vital stable, but weak. He's got the look, you know? Sarah knew. The look of someone whose body was betraying them, whose organs were staging a slow rebellion, whose hope was measured in the possibility of a stranger's death giving them life. The transplant list was a grotesque lottery where everyone lost something. Anyone else I should know about? Sarah scanned the board, noting the color-coded flags that indicated fall risks, medication schedules, behavioral concerns. Mrs. Patterson in 312 is confused again, thinks it's 1987 and keeps asking for her husband. He's been dead for 15 years. Margaret logged out of the system. Dr. Hammond did evening rounds already. She'll be back around 2 for the cardiac cases. She seemed stressed, more than usual. Dr. Patricia Hammond was always stressed. As chief resident, she carried the weight of the entire floor's decisions, the one whose signature appeared on the forms that determined who lived and who didn't, who got resources and who had to wait. Sarah had immense respect for her, though they rarely spoke beyond professional necessity. Hammond was brilliant, uncompromising, and rumored to have buried herself in work after some personal tragedy years ago. They had that in common at least, using the hospital as a fortress against their own lives. Margaret gathered her things, offering a tired smile. "Try to have a boring night." "You too," Sarah replied, knowing neither of them would. The ward settled into its nocturnal rhythm after Margaret left. Sarah made her first rounds, checking IV drips, adjusting blankets, scanning the monitors that tracked heartbeats and oxygen levels, and all the other numbers that stood between patients and oblivion. Most were sleeping or pretending to sleep, used to the intrusions that came with hospitalization. Privacy became a luxury you surrendered along with your clothes and dignity. Room 304 was at the end of the hall, the room nobody wanted because it was farthest from the nurse station, because it was where the oldest equipment got relegated, because over the years too many people had died in it, and staff developed superstitions about such things. The door was slightly ajar, and Sarah could see the pale blue glow of the cardiac monitor painting shadows on the wall. She knocked softly before entering, a courtesy many nurses abandoned, but Sarah maintained. "Mr. Torres, just checking your vitals." The man in the bed stirred. Even in the dim light, Sarah could see the toll that heart failure took. Daniel Torres had the grayish pallor of insufficient circulation, the subtle swelling around his ankles and fingers that indicated fluid retention. His chart said 42, but illness had aged him. His eyes, though, were sharp and alert when they found hers. "Sarah," he read from her name tag. "You're new. New to me. Night shift?" "5 years now," she said, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm drowning from the inside. That's what it feels like, Heart failure. Your body fills with fluid because your heart can't pump efficiently anymore. You're drowning in yourself." She noted his blood pressure, 110/68, acceptable but not great. His oxygen saturation was 94%, hovering at the edge of concerning. "Your numbers are holding steady. Are you managing to sleep?" "Some. Hard to sleep when you're wondering if you'll wake up." He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "You do this every night? Walk around taking care of people who are probably going to die anyway?" It was a blunt question, the kind most patients danced around. Sarah appreciated the directness, as it unsettled her. "I take care of people who are fighting to live. The outcome is not always in our control." Diplomatic answer. Daniel shifted in bed, wincing slightly. "I used to be a social worker. Spent 20 years helping families navigate systems that were designed to grind them down. Healthcare, immigration, housing. I got good at reading people, at seeing past their professional masks. You're good at your job, Sarah, but you're running from something. I can see it." Sarah felt a flash of irritation mixed with something uncomfortably close to recognition. She adjusted his IV drip, buying time. "My personal life is not relevant to your care, Mr. Torres. Call me Daniel." "And you're right, it's not. Sorry. When you're lying in bed all day waiting to find out if you're going to get a new heart or die trying, you start getting philosophical. Occupational hazard of having nothing but time to think." "How long have you been on the transplant list?" Sarah asked, redirecting to a safer territory. 4 months. Feels like 4 years. Daniel's hand moved to his chest, an unconscious gesture. "They say I'm a good candidate, good match potential, relatively young, but there are always complications, always someone sicker, always another reason to wait. Meanwhile, my heart gets weaker and the clock keeps ticking." Sarah made notes on her tablet, documenting his vitals and their conversation. "The doctors here are excellent. Dr. Hammond is one of the best cardiac specialists in the state." "I know. I did my research before I came here." Something in his tone made Sarah look up, but his expression was unreadable in the dim light. "County General has one of the highest transplant success rates in the region. I'm lucky to be here." Lucky felt like the wrong word for someone whose heart was failing, but Sarah didn't correct him. "Try to get some rest. I'll be back to check on you in a couple of hours." She was at the door when he spoke again. "Sarah, thank you for treating me like a person and not just a failing organ. It matters more than you'd think." Sarah nodded and left, unsettled by the conversation in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She had trained herself to maintain emotional distance, to see patients as clinical challenges rather than people with histories and hopes. It was the only way to survive the constant exposure to suffering. But something about Daniel Torres had slipped past her defenses, and she found herself thinking about him as she continued her rounds.
The rest of the floor was routine. Mrs. Patterson in 312 was indeed confused, calling out for Walter and becoming agitated when Sarah gently reminded her where she was. Sarah adjusted her medication slightly, noting it in the chart for Dr. Hammond to review. The post-op patients were both sleeping soundly, their incisions showing no signs of infection. The cardiac monitors on 3 other patients showed normal rhythms, no alarming changes. By midnight, Sarah was at the nurse station, updating charts and preparing medication doses for the 2 a.m. round. The floor was quiet, except for the ambient sounds of machines breathing for people who couldn't breathe for themselves, the monitors beeping their electronic reassurances, the occasional call light blinking for attention. She pulled up Daniel Torres' file on the computer, telling herself it was professional diligence. His medical history was straightforward enough. Progressive heart failure diagnosed 18 months ago. Deterioration despite medication, placed on transplant list 4 months prior. Previous address listed as somewhere in New Mexico. No local family listed as emergency contacts. Just a notation that his brother was deceased, died 3 months ago in a car accident. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy. To be facing death while still grieving a brother seemed particularly cruel. She wondered if that was part of what she'd sensed in him, that particular quality of someone who had already lost too much and was bracing for more loss. The cafeteria break at 1 a.m. was a sacred ritual. The hospital cafeteria transformed after hours into a strange liminal space, fluorescent lights buzzing over empty tables, vending machines humming in the corner. Sarah bought coffee that tasted like regret and sat at her usual table by the window, looking out at the city lights. This was when she allowed herself to think about the life she'd left behind, the divorce 3 years ago that had shattered the illusion of permanence she'd built, the way Michael had looked at her in their final argument, a mix of exhaustion and relief, as if he'd been waiting for permission to leave. They had wanted different things, or maybe they'd wanted the same things at different times and neither had been willing to bend. The night shift had been a choice made in the aftermath. Easier to avoid building a new life when you worked while the rest of the world slept. Easier to help others than to fix yourself. Easier to measure success in vital signs and medication doses than in emotional connections and vulnerability. She checked her watch. 1:23 a.m. Time to head back up. The 6th floor was exactly as she'd left it, which should have been reassuring, but instead felt ominous. The call light for room 304 was blinking. Sarah walked quickly down the hall, knocked, entered. Daniel was sitting up in bed, and in the better light from the hallway she could see that he looked worse. His breathing was more labored, small beads of sweat on his forehead despite the cool room temperature. "Chest pain?" Sarah asked immediately, moving to check his monitor. His heart rate was elevated, 118 beats per minute. "Not pain, exactly. Pressure, and I can't catch my breath. This happened yesterday too, but it passed." Sarah hit the call button for additional help and began a rapid assessment. Blood pressure was dropping, 98/62. Oxygen saturation had fallen to 89%. She increased his oxygen flow and pulled up his medication protocol on her tablet. "I'm going to give you a diuretic to help with the fluid buildup, and I'm calling Dr. Hammond. Just try to stay calm and breathe slowly." Sarah's voice was steady as her mind raced through possibilities. Acute decompensation, possible pulmonary edema, risk of arrhythmia. "I'm not dying tonight, am I?" Daniel asked, and there was dark humor in his tone. That would be ironic, after all this. "You're not dying on my watch," Sarah said firmly, preparing the injection. "I'm very stubborn about keeping my patients alive." She administered the medication and was reaching for the phone to page Dr. Hammond when Daniel's hand caught her wrist. His grip was weak but insistent. "Wait, before the doctor comes. I need to tell you something. In case. You're going to be fine. You don't know that. Nobody knows that. And there's something you should know. Something I should have said from the beginning." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Mr. Torres, right now we need to focus on your breathing. I'm not who you think I am." The words hung in the air between them. Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Hammond pushed through the door, all business and urgency. She took in the scene with a practiced glance, the monitors, Daniel's distress, Sarah's position by the bed. "Report," Hammond said crisply, moving to examine Daniel. Sarah provided the clinical details, vitals and timeline and interventions. Hammond listened while conducting her own assessment, her face unreadable. After several minutes of examination and adjustment of medications, Daniel's breathing began to ease. The crisis, if it had been a crisis, was passing. "We're going to move you to the cardiac ICU for closer monitoring. Your condition is less stable than we had hoped. We'll need to run additional tests in the morning." She turned to Sarah. "Arrange the transfer. I'll notify the ICU team." The next hour passed in the organized chaos of a hospital transfer. By 3 a.m., Daniel Torres was settled into a monitored bed 2 floors down, surrounded by more equipment and more intensive care than the general ward could provide. Sarah returned to the 6th floor, feeling strangely bereft, as if something important had been interrupted. "I'm not who you think I am." What had he meant? A metaphorical statement about how illness changes identity, or something more literal?
She tried to focus on her remaining patients, on the routine tasks that filled the hours until dawn, but her mind kept circling back to room 304, to the man who had somehow breached her carefully maintained walls in the space of a few hours. At 4 a.m., she returned to the cafeteria for another coffee, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The room was empty except for a janitor methodically mopping the far corner. Sarah sat with her phone, debating whether to text her ex-husband, to reach out to the sister she hadn't spoken to in months, to do something to connect with the world beyond these walls. Instead, she pulled up Daniel Torres' file again, reading through it more carefully this time. Something nagged at her, a detail that didn't quite fit. She compared the admission forms with the medical history, looking for the source of her unease. And then she saw it.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The signature on the transplant eligibility form didn't match the signature on the insurance documents. It was a small discrepancy, the kind of thing that could easily be a clerical error or a form filled out by different people at different times. But Sarah had spent 5 years reading medical charts, and she developed an instinct for when something was off. She pulled up the scanned copies of both documents, zooming in on the signatures. The transplant form, dated 4 months ago, showed a flowing, confident signature, Daniel R. Torres. The insurance verification from 6 months prior showed the same name, but the handwriting was noticeably different, more cramped, with a distinctive loop on the capital D that was absent from the later signature. Sarah told herself she was being paranoid. The lake asleep was making her see patterns that didn't exist. But the words kept echoing in her mind. I'm not who you think I am. She needed to let it go. It wasn't her job to investigate patients' paperwork. Her job was to administer medications, monitor vitals, keep people alive through the long hours of darkness. Getting involved in whatever this was, if it was anything at all, violated every principle of professional distance she'd spent years cultivating. Sarah closed the file and returned to the 6th floor. The rest of her shift passed without incident. She administered medications, responded to call lights, helped Mrs. Patterson find her way back from the bathroom when the elderly woman became disoriented again. At 6:45 a.m., the day shift nurse arrived, and Sarah provided her report, leaving out the strange unease that had settled in her chest. She drove home through the dawn light, exhausted but unable to sleep. Her apartment was a generic one-bedroom in a generic complex, furnished with the kind of temporary furniture that suggested someone who hadn't committed to actually living there. She'd moved in after the divorce and never quite moved past a provisional feeling. Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about signatures and secrets, and the look in Daniel Torres' eyes when he'd tried to tell her something. She thought about her own secrets, the ways she'd been hiding from life by immersing herself in death. She thought about Michael's final words to her. You can't save everyone, Sarah, and you can't use other people's problems to avoid your own. She slept fitfully and woke at 2 p.m., with the decision made. She would go back to the hospital early, before her shift started, and talk to Daniel Torres, not as a nurse performing her duties, but as one human being to another, asking him to explain what he meant. Sarah arrived at County General at 8 p.m., 2 hours before her shift. The cardiac ICU was on the 4th floor, a warren of glass-walled rooms where the sickest patients clung to life with the help of machines that breathed and pumped and monitored. She signed in as a visitor, prepared to lie about being a family friend if questioned. But the nurse at the desk barely looked up. Torres and 408, 10-minute limit. Room 408 was at the end of the hall. Through the glass wall, she could see Daniel connected to more equipment that he'd had upstairs. His eyes were closed, and for a moment she thought he was sleeping. Then he opened them and saw her. Sarah. Her voice was rough, strained. You came. I needed to understand what you meant last night. Before Dr. Hammond arrived, you started to tell me something. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, seeming to assess something. Then he nodded slightly. Close the curtain, please. Sarah pulled the privacy curtain around his bed, creating a small cocoon of isolation in the middle of the intensive care unit. Her heart was racing, and she wasn't sure if it was fear or anticipation, or both. What I'm about to tell you could get me killed, and it could get you in serious trouble just for knowing. You should walk away right now. Sarah sat down in the chair beside his bed. Tell me. My name
isn't Daniel Torres. I mean, it is legally now, but I was born Marcus Antonio Torres. Daniel was my younger brother, the brother who died 3 months ago in that car accident. Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her. You stole your brother's identity. I took his identity after he died, yes. Not to commit fraud or steal money, to survive. Marcus, not Daniel, closed his eyes. My brother had health insurance through his job. I don't. My brother was a citizen with documentation. I'm not. My brother was on the transplant list with a good match profile. I was dying in my apartment with no options and no hope. The implications cascaded through Sarah's mind. The transplant list, your medical records, everything is based on your brother's identity. Everything except my actual body, my actual failing heart that's killing me. Marcus opened his eyes, and there was anguish there mixed with defiance. I know what I did was wrong. I know it violates every rule. But my brother spent his last conscious moments in that hospital bed begging me to do it. He knew he wasn't going to make it, the doctors told us. And he knew I was dying too. He made me promise to use his insurance card, his ID, his place on the transplant list. He said at least one of us should survive. Sarah stood up, pacing the small space. Her training, her ethics, every professional instinct screamed at her to report this immediately. Identity fraud, medical fraud, stealing a spot on the transplant list meant someone else, someone who was actually Daniel Torres, wouldn't get that heart. Except your brother was Daniel Torres. He was on the list legitimately. His spot on the list is still his spot, just occupied by a different physical body. That's how I rationalized it at first, like I was just continuing his place in line, but I know that's bullshit. The medical history, the tissue typing, the compatibility assessments, they're all based on my brother's body, not mine. I'm committing fraud on every level. Why tell me this? Why risk exposing yourself? Because last night, when I thought I might be dying, I realized I couldn't go through with it. Not if it meant living the rest of my life as someone else, built on a lie. And because you're the first person in this hospital who looked at me like I was a human being and not just a case number. I'm going to confess. Tomorrow, when Dr. Hammond does her rounds, I'm going to tell her everything and accept the consequences. The consequences will be criminal charges, fraud, identity theft, and they'll remove you from the transplant list immediately. Without a heart, you'll die within weeks. I know, but maybe that's what I deserve. My brother spent his whole life doing things the right way, following the rules, and he died at 38 with his whole life ahead of him. I've spent my whole life trying to help people who fell through the cracks of the system, and I ended up in those same cracks. Maybe the universe is trying to tell me something. Sarah sat back down, her mind racing. She thought about systems and rules, about who they protected and who they crushed. She thought about the countless families she'd seen destroyed by medical debts, by lack of insurance, by the lottery of birth that determined who got care and who got left behind. She thought about Marcus's brother, using his last breath to try to save his sibling. Tell me about your work, the social work you did. For the next hour, Marcus told her stories. About the undocumented mother whose daughter needed cancer treatment and who he helped navigate a labyrinth of nonprofit hospitals and charity care programs. About the refugee family he'd spent 2 years helping resettle, finding them housing and schools and jobs. About the transgender teenager he'd protected from abuse and helped access medical care when their family abandoned them. I spent 20 years catching people before they fell through the cracks, and then I fell through them myself. My status, my lack of documentation, it made me invisible to the healthcare system. By the time I found a free clinic and got diagnosed, my heart was already too damaged. And the transplant list, you need citizenship or permanent residency to even be evaluated. I had neither.
Sarah understood then why he'd wanted to confess to her specifically. Not because she was a nurse or because she could do anything practical with the information, but because she represented the system that had failed him, and he needed someone from that system to bear witness to the injustice of it all. I need time to think, Sarah said finally. Don't tell Dr. Hammond tomorrow. Give me 24 hours. Why? What are you going to do? I don't know yet. Sarah stood up, checking the time. Her shift started in an hour. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Marcus studied her face, and whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. Okay, 24 hours. But Sarah, be careful. Hammond is brilliant, and she doesn't miss details. If she hasn't already figured out something's wrong, she will soon. Sarah left the ICU with her mind churning. She went through a shift on autopilot, performing her duties with mechanical precision while her thoughts spun in circles. What Marcus was doing was illegal. It was unethical. It undermined the integrity of the transplant system, and yet he was dying. And he had dedicated his life to helping others. And the system that was supposed to protect people had instead condemned him to death for the accident of where he was born. At 1 a.m., Sarah went to the cafeteria for her break. She sat at her usual table with her terrible coffee and pulled out her phone. She started searching for information about transplant lists, about identity verification, about the gaps in the healthcare system that left people to die. She read about the thousands of people who fell through those gaps every year, who couldn't afford care or couldn't access it, who were left to suffer and die while the system ground on indifferently. She was so absorbed in her reading that she didn't notice Dr. Hammond approach until the older woman slid into the chair across from her. "Mind if I join you?" Hammond asked, though she was already sitting. Sarah's throat went dry. She locked her phone screen quickly. "Of course not, Dr. Hammond." "Patricia, please, we're off the floor." Patricia had her own cup of coffee, equally terrible. She looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from years of carrying impossible responsibilities. "You've been a night nurse here for 5 years. We've barely spoken beyond patient reports. That's my fault. I tend to isolate myself." "You're busy," Sarah said carefully. "Chief resident of cardiac care isn't exactly a light workload." "No, it's not." Patricia sipped her coffee, grimaced. "You visited Daniel Torres in the ICU before your shift tonight. The nurse mentioned it." Sarah's heart hammered. I was concerned about his condition after the transfer. I wanted to check on him." "That's above and beyond for a floor nurse. Most would just read the updated chart." Patricia's gaze was penetrating. "You're a good nurse, Sarah. Competent, reliable, professional. You maintain appropriate boundaries with patients. So when you break those boundaries, it makes me curious about why." "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Patricia set down her coffee. "Let me tell you a story. 15 years ago, I had a daughter, Olivia. She was 17, brilliant, planning to study medicine like her mother. And then she got sick. Viral cardiomyopathy, sudden onset. Within months, her heart was failing. We got her on the transplant list immediately. She had good insurance. She had a top cardiologist for a mother. She had every advantage." Sarah remained silent, sensing there was more. "She waited 8 months, Patricia continued, her voice flat with the control of someone who had told this story too many times in her own head. 8 months while her heart deteriorated. 8 months while we kept her alive with medications and machines and hope. And then she died 2 days before a compatible heart became available. 2 days, Sarah. I have spent the last 15 years wondering if I'd been more aggressive, more connected, more willing to bend rules, whether I could have saved her. I'm sorry, that's an unbearable loss. It taught me something, though, about systems and rules and who they protect. The transplant list is supposed to be equitable, supposed to allocate organs based on medical need and compatibility, regardless of wealth or status or connections. But it doesn't work that way in practice. People with better insurance get better care while they wait. People with stable housing and family support have better outcomes. People who are born on the right side of various lines have better chances. The system is supposed to be fair, but it's built on top of profound unfairness. Sarah didn't know how to respond. She felt like she was being tested, but she couldn't tell what the right answer was. Daniel Torres interests me. His medical history is textbook, but something about it feels off. Little inconsistencies that don't quite add up. I've been a cardiologist for 25 years. I know when something doesn't fit. I also know when to look more closely and when to trust my instincts about a patient instead of just the paperwork. The silence stretched between them. Sarah felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, and her next words would either save her or send her plummeting.
What are you asking me, Dr. Hammond? Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Patricia stood up, collecting her coffee cup. I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you that sometimes the most ethical choice is the one that violates the rules. And sometimes the people who need saving are the ones who spent their lives saving others. She paused at the edge of the table. I'm also telling you that if you're going to do something that could jeopardize your career, you should be very careful about it. And you should know that you're not alone. She walked away, leaving Sarah sitting in the fluorescent glare of the empty cafeteria, her mind reeling. What had just happened? Had Hammond essentially given her permission to hide Marcus's secret? Or had she been warning Sarah that she already knew and was watching? Or was it something else entirely? A test? A trap? A genuine offer of alliance? Sarah returned to the 6th floor in a daze. She went through the motions of her remaining rounds, checking on patients, administering medications, updating charts. But her thoughts were miles away, cycling through impossible scenarios and moral calculations that had no clear right answer. At 3 a.m., unable to focus, she returned to the nurse station and pulled up Daniel Torres' file again. No, Marcus Torres' file, she corrected herself. She stared at the document, at the accumulated paperwork that represented a man's desperate bid to survive, and tried to see it through Patricia Hammond's eyes. What would Hammond have seen? The signature discrepancy that Sarah had noticed? The subtle inconsistencies in medical history? Places where Marcus's actual symptoms might not perfectly align with his brother's documented baseline? The absence of family visits, the way Marcus sometimes slipped and referred to my brother in the present tense before correcting himself? And if Hammond had seen those things, what had she done about it? Why hadn't she reported it immediately? She thought about what Hammond had said about her daughter, about the 2 days that had stood between life and death. She thought about a mother's grief transmuted into a career of saving others, and she wondered what lines Patricia Hammond might be willing to cross in the name of that impossible mission. The answer came at 6 a.m., just as Sarah's shift was ending. She was gathering her things when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Cafeteria, now, come alone, PH. Sarah's hands trembled as she made her way back down to the basement. The cafeteria was even more deserted at this hour, the cleaning crew long gone, the breakfast service not yet begun. Patricia Hammond sat at the same table they'd occupied hours earlier, but this time she had a laptop open in front of her. Sit, Hammond said without preamble. Sarah sat. I'm going to show you something, and then you're going to make a choice. She turned the laptop screen towards Sarah. It displayed a file directory, dozens of folders with patient identification numbers. This is information that should not exist. If anyone knew I had it, I would be fired immediately and probably face criminal charges. Sarah looked at the screen, then at Hammond. What is it? Insurance records, immigration status documentation, financial statements, background checks. Hammond's voice was level, clinical. For every patient on the transplant list at County General, I have information that goes far beyond their medical history. I know who has family support and who doesn't. I know who has stable housing and who's homeless. I know who's a citizen and who's not. I know who can afford the anti-rejection medications they'll need post-transplant and who can't. That's illegal data collection. Yes, it's also necessary, because the transplant list pretends to be objective, but it's not. It can't be. 2 patients with identical medical need and tissue matching, how do you decide who gets the heart? The official criteria don't account for social determinants of health. They don't account for who's more likely to survive long-term based on factors that have nothing to do with their bodies and everything to do with their circumstances. Sarah stared at the screen, at the implications of what she was seeing. You're manipulating the list. I'm optimizing outcomes. Hammond's correction was sharp. I'm making sure that the hearts we have available go to people who have the best chance of long-term survival, which means considering factors that the official system ignores. Sometimes that means moving someone up the list who shouldn't technically be there yet. Sometimes it means delaying someone who looks good on paper but has complications the system doesn't measure. That's playing God. We're always playing God in this job, Sarah. Every time we decide which patient to check on first, which emergency to prioritize, which medication to administer, we're making life and death decisions. I'm just doing it with more information and more honesty about what we're actually doing. Sarah felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. What are you showing me this for? Because Daniel Torres, or whoever he actually is, has been on my list for 3 months. I knew something was wrong with his paperwork almost immediately, but I also looked into his background, his real background, and I found Marcus Torres, former social worker, dedicated his life to helping vulnerable populations, ended up vulnerable himself due to documentation status. Hammond closed the laptop. Marcus Torres is exactly the kind of patient who should get a heart. His medical need is genuine, his likelihood of long-term survival is high, his contribution to society has been extraordinary. The only reason he wouldn't be on the transplant list is because of arbitrary rules about documentation. So you've been protecting him. I've been managing his case carefully, making sure his paperwork stays clean enough to avoid scrutiny from the transplant committee, and ensuring that when a compatible heart becomes available, he's in position to receive it. Hammond leaned back. But I can't do it alone anymore. His condition is deteriorating faster than anticipated. He's going to need more intensive management, more careful coordination between different departments, and for that, I need someone I can trust on the night shift. Someone who can monitor him closely, adjust his care as needed, and help me keep his secret until we can get him a heart. Sarah felt the weight of what was being asked. You want me to help you commit fraud? I want you to help me save a man's life, a man who has saved countless lives himself, a man who is dying because he was born on the wrong side of an imaginary line. Hammond's intensity was palpable. I watched my daughter die following all the rules, Sarah. I will not watch another person die when I have the power to prevent it, rules damned. And if we get caught? Then we both lose our licenses, we probably face criminal charges, we definitely destroy our careers, but Marcus Torres gets to live, and that's worth it to me. The question is whether it's worth it to you. Sarah thought about her 5 years of emotional distance, of hiding behind professional protocols, of using other people's suffering as an excuse to avoid her own life. She thought about Marcus dedicating 20 years to helping the vulnerable and ending up vulnerable himself. She thought about systems that killed people through indifference dressed up as fairness. She thought about who she wanted to be when this moment became a memory. "What do you need me to do?" Sarah asked. Hammond pulled a flash drive out of her pocket. "First, you need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Take this home, read everything on it. It contains documentation on 6 other patients I'm managing similarly, people who shouldn't be on the transplant list according to official criteria, but who deserve a chance at life. You need to understand the system before you can help me work around it." Sarah took the flash drive, feeling the weight of it in her palm like a grenade with the pin pulled. "Second, you need to keep Marcus stable while we wait for a heart. His real medical history is slightly different from his brother's documented history. The blood type is the same, but there are medication sensitivities that aren't in the official chart. I've put notes in an encrypted file on that drive. You'll need to check them whenever you administer new medications."
How long have you been doing this? Sarah asked. Managing patients off the books. Since Olivia died, 15 years. Hammond's expression was unreadable. I started small, pushing marginal cases through the evaluation process, advocating aggressively for patients who needed an advocate. Then I realized advocacy wasn't enough. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, which was the problem. So I started building a parallel system, one that actually prioritized saving lives over protecting institutions. How many people have you saved? 43. 43 people who got transplants who wouldn't have under the official system. And before you ask, none of them took hearts from people who needed them more. I've never pushed someone down the list to elevate my patients. I've just been more creative about defining eligibility and more aggressive about case management. Sarah absorbed this. 43 lives saved through systematic rule breaking. 43 people walking around with beating hearts who would otherwise be dead. How did you weigh that against the abstract principle of institutional integrity? "Why me?" Sarah asked. "You could have recruited any nurse." "I've been watching you for 5 years. You're competent, careful, and you follow protocols religiously. But I've also seen the way you look at patients when you think no one's watching. You care, Sarah, even though you try to pretend you don't. You're just scared of caring because it hurts. I needed someone who had the technical skill and the emotional capacity
even if that capacity was buried. Hammond stood up. I needed someone who could be trusted with this, and my instinct says that's you. Sarah stood as well, clutching the flash drive. When do we start? Tonight, your next shift. Marcus will be transferred back to the 6th floor. His vitals have stabilized enough that he doesn't need the ICU anymore. You'll be his primary night nurse. Check the encrypted files on that drive for his actual medication protocols. And Sarah? Hammond's gaze was steel. Once you're in this, there's no going back. If you have doubts, walk away now. But if you commit, I need you all the way in. Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. She went home as dawn broke over the city, the flash drive burning in her pocket. Her apartment felt different somehow, as if the decision she'd made had altered the space itself. She drew the curtains, plugged the drive into her laptop, and began to read. The files were meticulously organized. Each patient had a folder containing their official medical records alongside Hammond's private notes. Sarah read about a 47-year-old homeless man whose alcoholism had destroyed his liver, but who had been sober for 3 years. The official transplant criteria required 5 years of sobriety, but Hammond's notes documented his participation in AA, his volunteer work at a shelter, his determination to rebuild his life. He'd gotten a liver 2 years ago and was now working as a peer counselor helping other addicts. There was a 19-year-old with cystic fibrosis who needed a lung transplant, but whose family had let their insurance lapse. Hammond had manipulated billing codes and called in favors to get the girl evaluated and listed. She'd gotten her lungs 18 months ago and was now in college. There was a 62-year-old immigrant woman whose kidney failure had left her on dialysis for years. She didn't have citizenship, but she had lived in the U.S. for 40 years, raised 3 children, who are all now citizens themselves, paid taxes through an ITIN number, and contributed to her community in countless ways. Hammond found a loophole in the policy language and gotten her listed. She'd gotten a kidney and was now taking care of her grandchildren while her children worked. 43 stories. 43 lives saved through careful documentation, manipulation, strategic advocacy, and systematic rule-breaking. And now Sarah was being asked to become part of that system. She read Marcus's file last. Hammond's notes were extensive. Marcus had been born in Juarez, crossed into El Paso with his family at age 7, grew up undocumented but managed to get through school, became a social worker despite the limitations of his status. He'd helped hundreds of families navigate systems that were designed to exclude them. He'd never committed a crime beyond the administrative violation of his immigration status. And when his heart started failing, every door closed. His brother Daniel, 3 minutes younger but born on the American side of the border, had used his dying breath to give Marcus his identity. It was an act of love and desperation, and Hammond had discovered it within weeks of Marcus's admission to the hospital. Instead of reporting it, she had protected it. Sarah closed the laptop and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. She kept thinking about lines, literal lines like borders, abstract lines like rules and policies, personal lines about what you were willing to do to save a life. She'd spent 5 years staying safely on one side of all those lines. Now she was being asked to cross them. Her phone rang at noon. She almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed her sister Diane. Sarah? Did I wake you? I know you work nights. I'm awake. Sarah sat up. She and Diane had drifted apart after the divorce, not from any animosity, but from Sarah's deliberate withdrawal from her own life. Is everything okay? I've been thinking about you. We haven't talked in months, and I wanted to hear your voice. Diane paused. Are you okay? Really? Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I don't know. I think I'm in the middle of something important, and I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. Tell me. And Sarah did. Not the details. She couldn't violate patient confidentiality or implicate Diane in what she was considering. But she told her sister about the choice she was facing, about rules and compassion, about whether it was ever right to break the law to save a life. Diane listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, her sister was quiet for a moment. "Do you remember when Dad got sick and the insurance company kept denying his treatments? Remember how Mom spent 6 months fighting them, appealing every denial, finding every loophole?" "I remember." Diane continued. "Mom told me later that she'd lied on some of the forms. Not big lies, but strategic ones. Exaggerating symptoms to meet criteria, leaving out information that might disqualify him. She said she'd do it again in a heartbeat because the system was wrong and she refused to let Dad die because of paperwork." "Did she ever feel guilty about it?" "She felt guilty that she had to do it, but not about doing it." Diane's voice was firm. "The system that forces good people to lie to save the people they love is the guilty party, not the people trying to survive it." They talked for another hour about nothing and everything, rebuilding a connection that Sarah had let atrophy. When she hung up, she felt more grounded, more certain. That evening, she returned to County General with the flash drive memorized and destroyed. She had read everything twice, committed the critical information to memory, and then physically broken the drive and thrown the pieces in separate dumpsters. Hammond had taught her that lesson: never create evidence that could be discovered. Marcus was back in room 304 when Sarah started her shift. He looked better than he had in the ICU, some color returning to his face, his breathing less labored. When she entered to check his vitals, his eyes found hers with a question. "I talked to Dr. Hammond. I know everything, and I'm going to help." Marcus closed his eyes, and I saw relief wash over him. "Thank you. God, Sarah, thank you. Don't thank me yet. This isn't over. Your condition is still serious, and we need to keep you stable until a heart becomes available. That could be weeks or months." She checked his oxygen levels, his blood pressure, the metrics that define his existence. "How did I get so lucky," Marcus asked, "to end up with you two as allies?" "I don't think luck has anything to do with it," I said. "I think you spent 20 years putting good into the world, and now it's coming back. That's not how it works. I've seen too many good people suffer and too many terrible people prosper to believe in cosmic justice. But I'm choosing to believe that anyway." Sarah smiled slightly. "Besides, Dr. Hammond lost her daughter to the system. I think she's been looking for a way to save her ever since. You're just the latest in a long line." 43, Marcus said. 43 people. 43 people who were alive because she was willing to break the rules.
The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm. Sarah worked her night shifts with heightened awareness, monitoring Marcus's condition while maintaining the fiction of his identity. She learned to read Hammond's encrypted notes in the brief moments when she was alone at the nurse station, memorizing medication adjustments and care protocols that existed nowhere in the official record. Marcus's condition stabilized, then slowly deteriorated again. His heart was failing incrementally, each week bringing him closer to the edge. Hammond adjusted his medications aggressively, pushing the boundaries of standard protocols to keep him alive. They were buying time, but time was running out. Sarah found herself spending more time in room 304 than strictly necessary. She and Marcus talked during the quiet hours, sharing stories. He told her about the families he'd helped, the small victories and heartbreaking losses. She told him about her divorce, about the ways she'd been hiding from life, about the fear that had kept her emotionally frozen. "You're thawing," Marcus observed one night. "I can see it happening." "Helping you is helping me," Sarah admitted. "Turns out committing systematic fraud is good for my emotional health." Marcus laughed, then winced as the movement strained his weakened heart. "We're a support group for people destroying their lives to save mine. Very therapeutic." But the humor masked growing desperation. 4 weeks into their conspiracy, a compatible heart became available. Hammond called Sarah at home during her off hours. "We have a match, O-positive, good tissue compatibility, but there's a problem." Hammond's voice was tense. "The transplant committee is reviewing all pending cases. Routine protocol, happens every few months. They're gonna look closely at Marcus's file." Sarah felt ice in her veins. "How closely?" "Close enough to notice the inconsistencies if they're looking for them. And they might be. There's been pressure from the state medical board about transplant criteria. They're auditing programs across the state." "What do we do?" "I bought us 72 hours. The committee meets Thursday afternoon. I told them Marcus needs additional cardiac workup before we can finalize transplant authorization. But Sarah, if they dig into his background, they'll find the discrepancies. We need to prepare for the possibility that this falls apart. Sarah thought fast. What if we go public? Tell the story, Marcus's story, the families he helped, the injustice of the system. Get ahead of it. That's martyrdom, not survival. Marcus still dies, and we still lose our licenses. We just die on a hill of public sympathy instead of quietly in obscurity. Hammond was silent for a moment. Unless what? Unless we can demonstrate that the official system has been failing people systematically. Make it about policy failure rather than individual rule breaking. Hammond's mind was racing. Sarah could hear it. I have documentation on every case I've managed over 15 years. Patterns of who gets denied and why. Data on outcomes. If we could present it as research, as evidence that the current criteria are failing patients, it's still fraud. It's data, it's outcomes. It's proof that someone who cared enough to look could see the systemic failures. Hammond's voice gained strength. I can't present it myself. I'm too compromised. But you could. A floor nurse who noticed patterns, who started asking questions, who compiled evidence of disparate outcomes. Sarah understood what was being asked. Hammond needed her to become the public face of their conspiracy, to transform their rule-breaking into whistleblowing. It was dangerous and possibly career-ending, but it might be the only way to save Marcus. Send me everything, Sarah said. I'll figure out how to present it. The next 72 hours were a blur. Sarah barely slept, spending her off hours compiling Hammond's 15 years of careful notes into a presentable research format. She created charts showing survival rates of patients who had been marginal candidates. She documented the socioeconomic factors that predicted transplant denial despite medical need. She built a case that the system was fundamentally broken, using data that happened to include Marcus's case as one of many examples. Hammond, meanwhile, worked her connections. She reached out to colleagues at other hospitals, to medical ethicists, to anyone who might be sympathetic to an argument about transplant equity. She was building a coalition before they even knew what they were being recruited for. On Wednesday night, Sarah's last shift before the committee meeting, Marcus took a turn for the worse. His blood pressure dropped precipitously at 2 a.m., his heart rhythm becoming erratic. Sarah and Hammond worked together through the early morning hours, administering medications, adjusting equipment, doing everything possible to stabilize him. I'm not going to make it to the committee meeting, Marcus said, his voice weak. My heart's giving out. Your heart is being stubborn, Sarah corrected, checking his monitors. Just like the rest of you. You're going to survive this because you're too difficult to kill. But privately, Sarah and Hammond knew the truth. Marcus's heart was failing faster than anticipated. Even if they got committee approval for the transplant, he might not survive long enough for the surgery. At 4 a.m., in the quiet of room 304 with Hammond standing guard at the door, Marcus grabbed Sarah's hand. I need to tell you something, in case I don't make it. You're making it. Sarah, please. His grip was weak but insistent. When I took Daniel's identity, I found something in his papers. A safety deposit box key. I went to the bank, used his ID to access it. Inside were documents, not about him, but about our mother, our birth records, her immigration papers, everything. Sarah listened, confused about where this was going. Our mother wasn't Mexican. She was American, born in Texas, but she was young and poor, and when she got pregnant with us, she was living in Juarez with relatives. When it came time to deliver, there was a complication. She went to a hospital in El Paso for Daniel's birth, but I came too fast. She had me in the car while our aunt was driving across the bridge. That's why I'm listed as born in Mexico. My birth certificate was filed later, incorrectly. Sarah's mind reeled at the implications. You're saying you've been a U.S. citizen all along? I'm saying the paperwork was wrong. My whole life, living as undocumented, was based on an error in documentation. Daniel found the proof, kept it in that box. I think he was going to help me file for correction, but he died before we could do anything about it. Do you still have these documents? In my apartment, in a lockbox under my bed. The keys in my personal effects, the ones they took when I was admitted. Marcus's breathing was labored. If I die, Sarah promised me you'll make sure someone tells that story. Not for me, I'll be gone, but for everyone else caught in the trap. Promise me. I promise, but you're not dying. We're not letting you die.
At 6 a.m., Marcus's vitals stabilized enough for Sarah to leave him in Hammond's care. She went home, retrieved the key for Marcus's personal effects that Hammond had quietly secured, and drove to his apartment. The place was sparse, the home of someone who had been focused on survival rather than comfort. Under the bed, she found the lockbox. Inside were the documents Marcus had described: birth certificates, immigration papers, hospital records. And there, in faded ink, proof that his mother had been born in Houston, Texas, making her a U.S. citizen, making her children citizens regardless of where they were born. Sarah sat on Marcus's floor and wept, for the injustice of a life lived in fear because of paperwork errors, for the system that had condemned a good man to die because bureaucracy mattered more than truth, for all the Marcus Torreses in the world trapped in the gaps between documentation and humanity. She gathered the documents and drove back to the hospital. Hammond was waiting in the cafeteria, looking haggard. He's stable, barely. The committee meets in 8 hours. Hammond looked at the folder Sarah carried. What's that? Sarah explained, showing her the documents. Hammond examined them with a clinician's eye, verifying their authenticity. This changes everything, Hammond said slowly. If we can prove Marcus was legally a U.S. citizen all along, the entire fraud charge disappears. He wasn't stealing his brother's identity, he was using a brother's identity while his own citizenship status was in question. It's still using someone else's social security number, someone else's insurance. But the underlying premise changes. He's not an undocumented immigrant committing fraud. He's a citizen trying to survive while navigating documentation errors. Hammond's strategic mind was working. This gives us leverage. We go into that committee meeting with both arguments, the systemic evidence you compiled and Marcus's specific case as an example of how broken documentation can be fatal. What if they still say no? Then we go to the press. We make this a story about healthcare injustice, about broken systems, about a man who spent his life saving others and was abandoned by the institutions that should have protected him. Hammond's jaw was set. Either way, Marcus's story gets told, and maybe it changes things for the next person. The transplant committee meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the hospital's administrative conference room. Sarah wasn't supposed to be there. Floor nurses didn't attend transplant committee meetings, but Hammond had insisted, presenting Sarah as a researcher who had compiled data relevant to current cases. The committee consisted of 5 people: 2 cardiologists, a transplant surgeon, the hospital's chief medical officer, and an ethicist from the state medical board. They sat around a long table, reviewing files, their faces professionally neutral. Hammond presented Marcus's case first, laying out the medical facts: heart failure, transplant candidacy, compatible organ available. Then she invited Sarah to present her research. She stood, her hands shaking slightly, and began to speak. She talked about patterns she'd noticed over 5 years of night shifts, about patients who got denied despite medical need, about socioeconomic factors that predicted who lived and who died. She showed them data, charts, outcomes. The current transplant criteria claim to be objective, but they're built on assumptions that favor people who already have advantages: insurance status, documentation, stable housing, family support. These factors don't determine medical need, but they determine access, and people are dying because of it. The ethicist from the medical board, a woman named Chen, studied the data. This is compelling, but it's also a critique of the entire transplant system nationally. We can't change federal policy from one hospital committee meeting. No, Hammond agreed, but we can make decisions for our patients that acknowledge these realities. We can approve cases that might be marginal on paper, but represent good medical practice in context. The transplant surgeon leaned forward. Let's be specific. You're advocating for Daniel Torres, but his file has irregularities, documentation that doesn't quite align. Some of us have questions about whether all the information we have is accurate. This was the moment. Sarah and Hammond exchanged a glance. You're right to have questions, because the information isn't entirely accurate. Daniel Torres' real name is Marcus Torres. He's using his brother's identity because his own citizenship status was unclear due to documentation errors at birth. She laid out the evidence: the birth certificates, the proof of maternal citizenship,
The room went silent as committee members passed documents around, examining them. "If this is true," the chief medical officer said slowly, "then this isn't identity fraud. This is a documentation correction case. They'll happen. They're complicated, but they're not criminal." "We should verify this independently," Dr. Chen said. "These are serious claims." "Verify away," Hammond said calmly. "We're not asking you to take our word for it. We're asking you to consider that a man's life hangs on paperwork errors that aren't his fault. And while you're verifying, we have a compatible heart that's running out of time. Marcus Torres has hours, maybe days. If we wait for full verification, he'll die." The committee members conferred quietly among themselves. Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd risked, came down to this moment. Finally, the transplant surgeon spoke. "The medical case for transplant is sound. The identity documentation issues, while concerning, don't invalidate the medical need. If we can verify citizenship through these documents, even if the verification is post facto, then we're on solid ethical ground." "I move to approve," said one of the cardiologists. "Second," said the other. Dr. Chen hesitated. "I want it noted that this case raises serious questions about our verification processes and about systemic barriers to care. I'm approving the transplant, but I'm also recommending a full review of our eligibility criteria." The vote was unanimous. Marcus Torres was approved for transplant.
The transplant surgery happened that night. Sarah wasn't in the operating room. Floor nurses didn't observe transplants, but she waited in the surgical wing's family area, pacing between uncomfortable chairs and bad coffee. Hammond joined her on midnight. 7 hours so far, Hammond said, collapsing into a chair. Dr. Reeves says it's going well, but it's complex. Marcus's heart was in worse shape than we thought. Will he make it? Ask me in 12 hours. Hammond closed her eyes. Sarah, regardless of what happens tonight, you did an extraordinary thing. You stood in front of that committee and told the truth, knowing it could destroy your career. We both did. Yes, we both did. Hammond opened her eyes. I've been thinking about what Dr. Chen said about the systemic review. If they actually follow through, if this case prompts real examination of transplant criteria, it could help a lot of people. Or it could expose everyone I've helped over the past 15 years. If they audit past cases, they'll find the others. The pattern will be obvious. Hammond's voice was steady but resigned. I need you to understand that I'm prepared for that. If I lose my license, if I face charges, it was worth it. 43 people are alive who wouldn't be. Whatever price I pay, it's already been worth it. Sarah sat beside her mentor, this woman who had turned grief into purpose and rules into tools rather than barriers. What happens to them, the 43, if the audit finds them? Nothing, hopefully. They received legitimate transplants. The organs were allocated through proper channels. I just manipulated the documentation to get them considered. The organs themselves weren't stolen. They went to people who genuinely needed them and who genuinely benefited. At worst, there might be questions about eligibility, but you can't undo a successful transplant. They sat in silence, two women who had crossed lines together, waiting to learn if the man they'd saved would survive the saving. At 4:17 a.m., Dr. Reeves emerged from the surgical wing, still in scrubs, pulling down her mask. Her face was exhausted but satisfied. He made it. The heart is in, it's beating, his vitals are stable. The next 48 hours are critical for rejection, but right now, everything looks good. She sat down across from them. Patricia, that was one of the most compromised hearts I've seen in a viable transplant candidate. Another few days and he wouldn't have survived the surgery. You cut it very close. Story of my career, Hammond said with dark humor. Can we see him? I see you recovery in about an hour once we get him settled, but yes. Dr. Reeves paused. I heard about the committee meeting, about the citizenship documentation and identity questions. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. We lose too many good people to paperwork. After Dr. Reeves left, Sarah and Hammond sat for another hour processing what had happened. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and something like hope. I need to tell you something, Hammond said. About Olivia, my daughter. Sarah waited. I told you she died waiting for a transplant. That's true. But what I didn't tell you is that she didn't have to wait. There was a heart available, a good match. But she was second on the list at the time. The person ahead of her was an older man, sicker by the numbers. The committee followed protocol and gave him the heart. He died 3 days after the transplant. His body rejected it. Olivia died 5 days later, still waiting. Hammond's voice was carefully controlled, years of practice keeping emotion locked down. The system worked exactly as designed, followed every rule, and my daughter died because of it. The man who got her heart was statistically more deserving by the criteria, but Olivia was 17. She had her whole life ahead of her. And I spent years wondering if I could have done something, advocated harder, pulled strings, broken rules, to change the outcome. So you started breaking rules for other people's children, for other people's anyone. Because I realized that the rules were just someone else's opinion about what mattered, codified into policy. And opinions can be wrong. Policies can be changed. Systems can be challenged. I became a doctor to save lives. When the system started preventing me from doing that, I had to decide whether to serve the system or serve the mission. I chose the mission. At great personal cost. The cost of not doing it would have been greater. I would have lost myself completely if I just accepted that Olivia's death was inevitable, that nothing could have been done, that the system was fine, and I just had to live with the grief. Hammond stood up. Come on, let's go see if Marcus survives having a rule breaker for a doctor. Marcus was unconscious in the ICU recovery unit, surrounded by more equipment than Sarah had ever seen around a single patient. But his new heart was beating strongly, the monitor showing a rhythm that his old failing heart had been unable to maintain. Over the next 3 days, Sarah visited during her off hours, watching Marcus slowly emerge from sedation. When he finally woke fully, groggy and in pain, but undeniably alive, his first words were a mumbled, "Did it work?" "You have a new heart. It's working beautifully. You're going to live." Marcus closed his eyes, tears leaking out. "I can't believe it. After everything." "Believe it. You survived because you refused to give up, and because people cared enough to bend the world to save you." Over the following weeks, as Marcus recovered, the promised systemic review began. Dr. Chen from the medical board was thorough, examining transplant practices at County General going back a decade. Sarah and Hammond waited for the other shoe to drop, for the pattern of Hammond's interventions to be discovered. But something unexpected happened. Dr. Chen's review expanded beyond County General to include transplant programs across the state. And what she found was that nearly every program had similar patterns of unofficial flexibility interpreting eligibility criteria. Hammond wasn't an aberration. She was just more systematic and more documented than most.
Turns out everyone's been breaking the rules, Hammond reported after a meeting with Chen. Transplant coordinators advocating creatively for patients, surgeons finding loopholes in protocols, social workers helping patients navigate documentation requirements in ways that might not be entirely by the book. The whole system runs on people caring enough to work around its worst features. So what happens now? Chen's recommending policy changes, broader eligibility criteria, better accounting for social determinants of health, more flexibility in documentation requirements. She's using Marcus's case as the poster child. Citizen denied care due to paperwork errors, nearly died because of it, saved by doctors willing to look past the surface documentation. Hammond smiled slightly. We're being held up as examples of good medical practice, not rule breakers. That's not what I expected. Me either. Apparently, sometimes the system can recognize its own failures, if you force it to. Though there will still be an audit of my past cases. I'm not off the hook entirely. But Chen seems inclined to view it as aggressive advocacy rather than fraud, as long as the outcomes support it. Marcus was discharged 6 weeks after his transplant, weak but recovering, his new heart settling into its work of keeping him alive. Sarah and Hammond met him at the hospital cafeteria on his last day, a fitting location for the final chapter of their conspiracy. I don't know how to thank you. You both saved my life at enormous risk to yourselves. You don't need to thank us.
You spent 20 years saving lives. We just even the scales a little. What will you do now? Hammond asked, once you're fully recovered. Marcus smiled. Go back to work. Social work, helping families navigate systems. But now I have a new perspective on it. I've been on both sides of the documentation divide. I understand viscerally how arbitrary it all is. I think I can be more effective with that knowledge. And your citizenship status? Being processed. The documents Sarah found are legitimate. It'll take months to sort through, but the lawyers say it's straightforward. I should have official confirmation of citizenship within the year. Marcus's expression turned serious. But even if I do, I'll never forget what it was like to be on the other side. To be denied care. To be invisible. To be discarded by systems that were supposed to protect everyone. They talked for another hour about recovery plans and policy changes and the strange journey that had brought them together. When Marcus finally left, walking slowly, but walking, Sarah and Hammond sat in the empty cafeteria. What about you? The audit is still ongoing. You could still face consequences. I could. Probably will face some kind of sanction, even if it's just official censure. Hammond didn't seem particularly concerned. But I have 15 years of excellent outcomes. I have 43 people who are alive and healthy because of decisions I made. I have data showing that my interventions improved survival rates for marginal candidates. It's hard to argue with success. And if they take your license, then I'll find other ways to do the work. Consulting, advocacy, policy reform. The mission doesn't change just because the methods do. Hammond looked at Sarah. What about you? You've been different these past few weeks, more present, more engaged. What's changed? Sarah thought about it. I think I realized that emotional distance wasn't protection. It was prison. I was so scared of being hurt by caring that I stopped caring at all. Helping Marcus, breaking rules with you, risking something for someone else, it felt like coming back to life. Like remembering who I used to be before I got so scared. And who are you now? Someone who understands that caring is worth the risk, that following rules blindly is its own kind of cowardice, that sometimes the most ethical thing you can do is recognize when the system is wrong and have the courage to act accordingly. Sarah smiled. I'm someone who learned that from a doctor who lost her daughter and a social worker who nearly died from paperwork. I'm grateful for both lessons. Hammond reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand briefly, a rare gesture of warmth from the usually reserved doctor. You're going to be a better nurse for this, not just technically, but humanly. The patients who get you on their worst nights are lucky. I hope so. I want to be the kind of nurse who sees people, not just cases, who understands that healing isn't just about treating symptoms. It's about recognizing humanity in all its complicated contexts. They parted ways in the hospital lobby, both heading off to continue their work of saving lives in a system that made that work unnecessarily difficult. Sarah felt different as she walked to her car. Lighter somehow, despite carrying the weight of everything they'd done. The rules they'd broken hadn't destroyed her. They'd liberated her from the prison of her own fear.
6 months after Marcus's transplant, Sarah arrived at County General for her night shift to find an unfamiliar face at the nurse station. A young nurse, probably mid-20s, nervously organizing supplies and looking overwhelmed. "You must be Sarah," the young woman said. "I'm Jennifer. I had just transferred to nights. Margaret said you'd show me the ropes." Sarah smiled, remembering her own early days of night shifts, the overwhelming sense of responsibility mixed with inadequacy. "Welcome to the 6th floor. The night shift is different from days, quieter usually, but the quiet can be deceptive." She spent the first hour of her shift orienting Jennifer, showing her where supplies were kept, explaining the idiosyncrasies of the equipment, introducing her to the regular patients. As they worked, Sarah found herself sharing not just practical information, but philosophy. "The most important thing about night nursing," Sarah said, "is understanding that you're seeing people at their most vulnerable. The darkness, the pain, the fear, everything is amplified at 3 a.m. Your job isn't just to administer medications and check vitals. It's to bear witness to their humanity, to remind them they're not alone." "That sounds like a lot of emotional labor," Jennifer observed. "It is, and you have to be careful not to let it destroy you. But you also can't wall yourself off completely or you stop being effective. It's a balance, caring deeply while also taking care of yourself." Sarah thought about her own journey to that understanding. Sometimes breaking your own rules is necessary to become who you need to be.
They were checking on patients in the cardiac wing when they passed room 304, the room that had started everything. It was occupied now by a new patient, an elderly woman with heart failure, waiting and hoping, like Marcus had waited and hoped. Sarah knocked and entered, introducing Jennifer and conducting the routine check. The woman, Mrs. Alvarez, looked at them with the exhausted gratitude of someone who had learned to appreciate small kindnesses. "Thank you for checking on me," Mrs. Alvarez said softly. "I know it's your job, but it feels like more than that when you do it." "It is more than a job," Sarah said, adjusting the woman's blanket. "It's a privilege to take care of you." After they left the room, Jennifer asked, "Are you always talking to patients like that, so personally?" "I do now. I didn't always. I used to think professional distance meant emotional distance. I was wrong." Sarah checked her tablet, noting Mrs. Alvarez's vitals. "I learned from a patient in that same room that sometimes the people we take care of teach us more about nursing than any textbook." At 1 a.m. during their cafeteria break, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Hammond. "Conference room C, if you're free. Want to show you something." Sarah found Hammond in one of the small conference rooms, laptop open, looking energized despite the late hour. "Sarah, look at this. Dr. Chen's full report on transplant equity just came out, and it's being presented to the state medical board next month, and they're using it as the basis for new guidelines." Sarah studied the data. The report documented systematic barriers to transplant access across demographics: citizenship status, insurance coverage, housing stability, language barriers. It showed outcome disparities that had nothing to do with medical factors and everything to do with social ones. And it proposed concrete policy changes to address those disparities. "This is Marcus's case," Sarah pointed to a highlighted section. Anonymous, but yes, the report uses his story as a central example of how documentation errors can be fatal, how rigid interpretation of eligibility criteria can deny care to people who would benefit from it. Hammond scrolled through more pages. But look at the recommendations. Broader eligibility definitions, flexibility in documentation requirements, mandatory consideration of social determinants of health, independent patient advocates for every transplant evaluation. These are the things you've been doing unofficially for 15 years. Exactly. They're codifying the workarounds into official policy, which means I won't need to work around the system anymore. The system will have changed. Hammond leaned back. The audit of my cases concluded last week. Official result? Aggressive advocacy within acceptable bounds of medical judgment. No sanctions, no license restrictions, just a recommendation that future interventions be documented more thoroughly. Sarah felt relief wash over her. "So you're safe. We're both safe. And more importantly, future patients are safer. The system isn't perfect. It never will be. But it's better than it was 6 months ago. We did that, Sarah. You and me and Marcus and everyone else who refused to accept that the status quo was acceptable." They talked about the changes, about the patients who would benefit, about the slow work of systemic reform. When Sarah returned to the floor, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not everything was fixed, but some things were better. That had to be enough. The rest of her shift passed in routine tasks, punctuated by small human moments. Mrs. Patterson in 312, still confused, but smiling when Sarah found her favorite music on her phone and played it softly. A young man in 308 who was terrified about his upcoming surgery, who needed someone to listen to his fears without minimizing them. An elderly man in 315 who just wanted to talk about his grandchildren, who needed to be reminded that his life had meaning beyond his illness. At 4 a.m., Sarah took another break and checked her personal email. There was a message from Marcus, subject line, "Update from the world of the living." She opened it eagerly. "Sarah, it's been 6 months since the transplant, and I'm doing remarkably well according to all the doctors. No rejection episodes, strong cardiac function, energy levels I haven't had in years. I'm back to work part-time, helping families navigate the immigration and healthcare systems, but I do it now with the kind of authority that comes from having lived through the worst of what those systems can do. I wanted you to know that I'm using my experience to train other social workers. I'm teaching them how to advocate more aggressively, how to find loopholes, how to push back against unjust denials. I'm trying to multiply the impact of what you and Dr. Hammond did for me by empowering others to do the same. Also, and this is the real reason I'm writing, I've been asked to testify before the state legislature next month about healthcare access for undocumented and marginally documented people. They're considering a bill that would expand transplant eligibility.
I'm going to tell my story with your permission, not using your names, but talking about the doctors and nurses who saw me as a human being worth saving despite the paperwork problems. I hope you're well. I hope you know that you changed more than just my life. You changed how I think about what's possible when people care enough to act. That's a gift I'll spend the rest of my life trying to pay forward. With gratitude, Marcus. Sarah read the email twice, feeling tears prick her eyes. She typed a quick reply, giving him permission to tell his story, encouraging him to be as specific as possible about the barriers he had faced. Then she sat for a moment in the empty cafeteria, processing the magnitude of what had happened.
6 months ago, she'd been going through the motions of her job, emotionally disconnected, hiding from life behind professional protocols. Now she was part of something larger, a movement, however small, to make healthcare more humane. She'd broken rules and risked her career, and in doing so, had found her way back to the person she'd meant to be. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her sister Diane. "Are you working? Can you talk?" Sarah called her, and Diane answered immediately. "I just wanted to hear your voice," Diane said, "and tell you I'm proud of you." "For what?" "For whatever you've been doing these past 6 months that's made you sound like yourself again. You're different when we talk now, more present, more engaged. I don't know what changed, but I'm grateful for it." Sarah smiled. "I learned that caring about things is better than being safe from caring about things." Deep. Did you get that from a fortune cookie? From experience, the hard kind. Sarah checked the time. "I should get back to work, but Diane, thank you for calling, for staying in touch even when I was pulling away. It mattered." That's what sisters do. We don't let you disappear even when you're trying to. After the call ended, Sarah returned to the 6th floor with renewed purpose. She found Jennifer struggling with a medication dose calculation, walked her through it patiently. She sat with Mrs. Alvarez for 10 minutes just holding the frightened woman's hand and talking about her grandchildren. She checked on every patient personally, not just scanning monitors, but actually seeing the human beings connected to them. At 6 a.m., as the night shift ended and the day shift began, Sarah gave her report to the incoming nurse. She mentioned Mrs. Alvarez's anxiety, the young man's surgical fears, Mrs. Patterson's good night. She provided not just clinical data, but context, the human details that would help the day nurses provide better care. Margaret, the day shift nurse, looked at her with something like respect. "You've changed, Sarah. These reports used to be all business. Now you actually tell us about the patients." "I learned that the patients are the business," Sarah said simply. She drove home through the dawn, exhausted but satisfied. Her apartment still wasn't much. She hadn't suddenly transformed into someone who cared about interior decoration, but it felt less temporary now, like a place she actually lived rather than just slept. She made coffee and sat by the window, watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there, Marcus was recovering, living a life that shouldn't have been possible. Hamden was working on systemic reforms that would help countless future patients. Jennifer was learning to be a nurse who saw people, not just cases. Mrs. Alvarez would face another day of waiting and hoping, but she'd do it knowing someone cared. Sarah thought about systems and rules, about when to follow them and when to challenge them. She thought about the courage it took to care deeply in a world that often punished caring. She thought about the unexpected ways that saving someone else's life could save your own. Her phone pinged with one final message. It was from Hamden, sent to what Sarah now realized was a group chat that included several other nurses and doctors from County General. "Team meeting next week. New protocols for transplant evaluations need nursing input. Sarah, I'm putting you on the implementation committee. Your experience with patient advocacy will be valuable. Also, drinks after to celebrate not getting fired. P.H." Sarah smiled and sent back a simple thumbs up. Then she set her phone aside, finished her coffee, and went to bed. She slept deeply, without the nightmares that had plagued her for years, without the sense of running from something she couldn't name. She slept like someone who had found her way home.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.